Did you know that you are wonderfully weird? You've been created to be as unique and one of a kind as your fingerprint, fearfully and wonderfully made, created in the image of God. My name is John Waters, and over the next few minutes, Drake Hunter, senior pastor at Elevating Life Church in Fort Morgan, Colorado, and author of the book Wonderfully Weird, now available through Westbow Press, will help you learn more about your own wonderful weirdness. Now, Wonderfully Weird Living. Here we are once again on Wonderfully Weird Living. I am John Waters, your host. My guest and co-host, cohort, whatever you want to call him, author, speaker, Pastor Drake Hunter. Hello again.
Hello. As always, as I share every week, what a privilege and honor, and how much fun this is. Thanks for trusting me to help you out with this, John.
No, it's quite the opposite.
Is it the opposite?
No. Well, we were just talking before we started recording here today, Drake. Last week was so much fun having Jeremiah and Katana Pate here on the program, as well as they prepare for mission work, going over to Thailand and going on mission, which is kind of what we're going to be talking about a little bit here in a way, here in a little bit. But what a great couple.
They are. They're wonderful. And they connected with us just slightly a couple of days ago, so they're doing well. They're back in Cheyenne. They're getting involved with the church up there and doing some fundraising to get them to where they need to be on the mission field in Thailand.
Yep. So thank you once again to Jeremiah and Katana for being our guests here on the podcast last week. Well, moving forward, Drake, this week at Elevating Life Church for the second week in a row, we used a Star Wars theme to set up the message, which is always fun. The way my voice was feeling, I think I could have dressed up as Darth Vader and done that whole... I had a little bout of pneumonia last week.
Yes,
so,
you did, but you did well.
But and the title of the message and where we want to start is May the Force be with you. And so let's talk about from that 30,000 foot view to start with, when you say may the force be with you, what that force is.
Yeah, let's go to the up in the galaxy. How's that sound?
There you go.
And of course, when I'm introducing the message on Sunday, and what this message is all about is literally, thinking about God's love and how His love covers all things and actually exist also above all things. And so, in a galaxy far, far away, not too far away, but above us and around us and in us, and God's force be in us was the point of theme, if you will. Then of course we went in that direction to really uncover what that means in the sense of redemption and restoration, in the sense of our salvation and our experience with God and with other people.
Well, and using that theme of May the Force be with you from Star Wars, of course, for those who understand the Star Wars universe, the Force is made up of two sides. There's the light, the Force,
yes,
and then there's the dark side.
Yes.
And we talked about that a little bit, or you did yesterday a little bit, about that, the juxtaposition, to
yes,
use that word, of those two, the light and the darkness.
Yes. It's kind of like I'm studying right now nonfiction with fictions, but no matter how you write or how you present a story, there's always those two sides, and it does make it interesting. But at the same time, we need to understand in our position as Christ followers, as Christians, that we are to live in the force of God's love first and foremost. God said that is our priority. But on the other side, with that juxtapose, if you will, or that antithesis happening, we have to understand there is a mission. There's a focus there when it comes to who we are. But as we all know, we do have to have that redeemed life in place before that restoration or that goodness of life can be, experienced for the Christian. And of course, isn't that the challenge, John? That we have some people that actually live in the value of Christianity, not necessarily redeemed, and they're trying to truly create this good life, and you can do that to a point. We see that with non-Christians, but they don't understand the redemption aspect. But on the other side of the coin, we have a lot of Christians, a lot of believers who have been redeemed but that's it. The restoration, let's say, understanding is not there in place. And I compared this to fire insurance, if you will. There's a lot of people that accept Jesus, but that's where it basically stops, and they receive that fire insurance and then nothing.
Right.
Well, we
Just
got to get
sitting on the
restoration.
shelf.
Yeah, we got to get restoration in there. Or as Paul says, a better way to put that is that we got to work out that salvation from that point after justification and then let's say adoption and that third piece, regeneration happens. Well, then at that point, we've got to get restoration in place. And I believe that's the direction we're going to go this morning and really clear that up. Excuse me.
Right. Well, and you used the Great Commandment from Matthew chapter 22 to set up the first part of that. I'll just read it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And I found it very interesting, and I would like you to dive into this a little bit. You then took us to the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
In the message,
yes.
To talk about Adam and Eve and their encounter with the serpent. And I thought that you made some incredible, brilliant points about that encounter.
Right, and many people misunderstand the narrative there, the understanding of the garden experience. Adam and Eve, most understand they lived there with God, but then of course here comes the serpent who project let's say a thought or an idea to Eve, and through that she had to think through that with her mind, and then of course she made the choice. There's your soul, and then with her heart, her passions, her feelings, she moved on, made the choice to accept that idea, that thought. Mm-hmm. But in the words I believe I used on Sunday was Eve, like a fish, took the bait, and then grabbed it and hook, line, and sinker. Now they're guilty. They're guilty of falling into the plan outside of God. And of course, Satan or the serpent was the one that projected that particular thought. And Satan didn't make the decision for her or them. They did.
So in other words, it comes down to personal responsibility.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what salvation is all about, mm-hmm. in the sense of we have a responsibility now in the relationship we have been given in life to really step into the kingdom or not. To, take the thoughts of the world or to truly take the truth and the reality of God and live in that direction.
So we live in what you called redemptive time.
Yes.
Now, and as opposed to eternity.
That's right. And so let's kind of continue that discussion in the garden, because they lived in eternity. So through God's love to protect Adam and Eve, he had to get them out of the garden. And through his love, he removed them from the garden. And from that, if you read Genesis 1, 2, and 3, especially 3:15, you'll see the first and foremost, the boundaries of the consequences of sin and all that. But on the other side, we also see Jesus coming into the picture, salvation, and this is how you get back into the garden. Before Adam and Eve were even outside of the garden. And then, of course, at that point now, we're now standing where we're at today in redemptive times. You have a choice to redeem your life. God gives you that choice. And we must hear God's voice, as I wrote about yesterday in my devotion. And then we must make the proper choice and step into the kingdom and live in the kingdom where the tree of life does exist, and that we can truly enjoy the fruits of life the way God intended or how he planned life to be.
So now we move into redemption and restoration then. So, and I'm going to quote you here from your message yesterday. I have the manuscript in front of me.
Okay.
You said, redemption and restoration are needed to experience the fullness or integrity of God's love and goodness. So let's look at these two individually now,
Yes.
and starting with redemption, and let's really dive deeply into this.
Okay, when I say redemption, or when I shared that, of course, when it comes to theology, this is just known as the greatness of God. These are God's natural attributes or qualities that we see in nature and history. We also see these qualities in design, especially the design of mankind. We've all been created in the image of God, and we see this. We see these qualities of God, and we can say His direction, His Spirit. Let me get into this a little deeper, as you have asked. His personality. That's the book Wonderfully Weird. Really leans into this natural attribute of God that sits in His greatness, which gives us understanding of that redeemed life. And then, of course, we have His qualities of what is known as infinity. I always think of Toy Story there, John. To infinity and beyond, and of course His constancy and everything that sits in the sense, or should I say, is the content of God's greatness in our finite understanding. I'm sure there's so much more than that, but where we're at in history today, we can truly see the greatness of God. And isn't that exactly what we're after, in the sense of when we're sitting in these redeemed times, we want that type of life. We want proper direction. We want proper energy. We want to make sure that our personality and that personhood that God has given us lines up with who God is. And we also want that life. And life means that you're living in the here and now and moving forward one pebble at a time towards that direction with that focus. And then, of course, infinity just implies with an open mind that we can see that that God is the source of life. And then, of course, and we're consistent. That's not necessarily what constancy is, but in this conversation that makes sense. And then we're actually restoring our life now through this greatness. It's God's greatness that must be put in place. It's also, can we say, God's framework, or we can say context, that we have to get, or Henry Cloud puts it, His boundaries, right? We got to get those in place. We've got to redeem our life, because we've, through our teachings and experiences and who we hang around with and all of that, man, we've knocked those boundaries down, and we've caused some hardships, and pretty much we're facing death rather than life. So that has to be in place. In the sense of who we are, and of course, Jesus said to the Pharisees, "What's the primary command or direction, or directive that I need to put in place?" And He says, "Well, first and foremost, you've got to love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then you got to love your neighbor as yourself." Now, this refers to perspective, doesn't it? The perspective of God. And let me share this before we move on to restoration, is that means you have the perspective of God with your neighbor as yourself. Well, that just means that you're rooting for your neighbor as much as you're rooting for yourself, in the sense of getting a very best life in place. Because oftentimes we think that our neighbor, of course, we want to define that in the sense of perhaps a few people living in us. It's referring to the human race. And then, of course, then we have to bring like-minded people into that. But then, no matter who you are, for God so loved the world, that's our perspective. And we love our neighbor, first and foremost, on the grandest scale of what that is. And then, of course, as ourself, and of course, when we are standing in as a redeemed person, a Christian, then we can only see our neighbor through that love that is referred to in John 3:16, where we love the world so much that we're willing to give, sacrifice as God did. And so, yeah, that's redemption, a redeemed life. And this happens when we call this being born again. You got to repent, right? First command of Christ. But then you've got to commit to that, and then you have to be engaged in what that is all about. And then you make a decision, just like I did with Sherry, my wife. I asked her to marry me, and we're going to go in this direction, if you will. Well, God, I'm going to ask if I could be married to you, and then I'm going to commit. I'm going to be engaged. Now we're born again. New perspective, new life, new philosophy. Bam. Now what?
It seems to me that maybe we've been a little bit confused about redemption in a way, in that I know I grew up understanding or believing that redemption was all something that God did.
Yes.
That I didn't have a role in it. God redeemed me, which is true.
Yes.
That's absolutely true. But then there's also my part in that as well, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's relationship, because if it's all God, it's one-sided. And then one-sided, well, if it was just one-sided, think about it. Adam and Eve would have stayed in the garden for eternity and would have experienced hell, if you will, that misery for all eternity. But he loved us too much, and that's not his plan. His plan was he created us to truly have a relationship with us, and to have relationship, true relationship, means you have the choice. So you have to make the choice consciously. And we do that in the sense of when we hit the age of accountability, whatever that might be for a person, and then we lean into that so that we can truly now develop that redeemed life, to restore it in the sense of goodness, to really live in the promised land, or we can say the garden where the tree of life does exist now and for all eternity.
So then we move into the next part, which is the restoration.
Yes.
The redeeming is the beginning.
Yes.
Kind of that first
That's
step.
right.
And then we move into restoration. And I mentioned to you before we started recording that unfortunately, I think too many times people just stop after the redemption. They're redeemed, and then, as you kind of alluded to a little bit ago, they're happy right there without any true restoration happening.
Yeah, and there's a couple of issues there, of course, when somebody says, well, I've been redeemed. But think about this, John. If there is no conviction, a conviction is just a strong belief in the sense of that commitment and that engagement, and there is no conviction to move forward. That strong belief to truly to inspire your life and to be motivated to really put that restoration. You've got to question one or two things: is either you did not become a Christian, or you are quenching the Holy Spirit with your self-centeredness. As I shared, I didn't share it this week, as I shared often, is that those phrases, you believe you're all that in a bag of Doritos with the Mountain Dew on the side, or I'll do what I want.
Yeah.
and it doesn't work. So then what happens, though, if you're a true redeemed Christian? Well, let's go back to the story of Jacob, right? Well, he lived his life. He was not doing well, if you know the story in the Old Testament, where he finally came to a point where he came face to face with God. And what did God have to do to get this redeemed person to the point where he's truly restoring now, we'll say Israel, because Jacob became Israel, but after his hip was broken, after a lot of struggles, and there's a lot of chatter, if you will, that you have to go through that type of brokenness. I beg to differ. God does not want to break your hip.
Right.
But if you are true in your heart, which most are, and you are truly going in that direction, how else can he get his attention except in that very immature way that has to be put, not because of his immaturity, but because of yours.
Right.
And so who here wants to go through that? God never wants to hurt us in that sense, but if he has to, he will, to get your attention. And then, of course, then you're going to walk around with a limp. Well, I would say this if you're listening. Well, before you get that, make a choice to just change your perspective, if you will. Quit being all that in a bag of Doritos with Mountain Dew on the side, and just do it God's way and get into a trusting relationship first with God, and then find that those relationships in church or whatever that might be to get you to the goodness of life.
Well, so there may be those out there right now that are saying, okay, I understand. I need to move forward. How do I go about doing that in the restoration process? And you alluded to it earlier, but we have the commands of Christ.
We have the commands of Christ. So as I shared at the end of that message, what doesn't happen is this: we become born again or redeemed Christian, and all of a sudden we think we have arrived. right? And there's no maturity or objective training in place. Well, Jesus came, we see this in the New Testament. He had to give these commands, these directions. We call it implicit communication, if you will. And he's doing this to give us direction, or those directives, so that we can get the basics of our redeemed life or in place, so that we can restore our life to the place of goodness. And I believe I used the analogy. Can you imagine, John, walking into a heart surgeon's office? You need surgery, and the doctor, he or she, comes to you and says, "Hey, I don't have any objective training. However, I can feel it out. Whatever that might be. Come and hop on the table, if you will, and we'll make the best of it." That doesn't work.
Yeah, Mom and Dad were heart surgeons, so I get it. So I get it naturally because they were heart surgeons.
Yeah, and so it just doesn't work. We have to understand how life truly works, and you can see this as it shares in the Scripture. Doesn't nature itself tell you that this is to be true? We become born again, a new child of God, if you will, a baby of God, and then we have to be taught. We have to have those relationships in place, and now new experiences that then will get us through that very immature state, which, that's part of life, to help you develop, get those values in place, get those commands in place, and develop you as a very young Christian. And this is what the church should be doing. This is called discipleship, sanctification, if you will, getting those commands in place first and foremost. Hey, I appreciate if you know all 66 books of, the Protestant Bible. Good for you. Well, that shouldn't be your priority. Let's get the commands of Christ, the basic commands of Christ, into first and foremost into our working memory, so that we can get them into our heart, so then we can resolve problems in our soul, in our character, if you will, make those choices, so that we will develop a character that is of goodness, and that will truly reflect, or the results will be the fruits of the Spirit. And then when somebody does experience you, when they do take a bite out of your experience, they experience that Isaiah 11 experience, Jesus, right? Wisdom and all the different qualities that exist there in Isaiah chapter 11, wisdom, understanding. What's the other ones? I'm losing them there, but there's 7 of them. Right. That's strong, the stump of Jesse. And so that's the process, but you have to get in front of somebody who is mature and get that objective training, rather than just plopping yourself down and figuring it out by yourself, and you're going to fill it out and hopefully it works for the best, like that heart surgeon. It does not work that way. It does not function that way. That's now how restoration is put in place, in the sense of that immature to maturity.
Restoration doesn't happen by osmosis, it happens by intentionality.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Seek God's kingdom comes to mind.
Right.
And so, yes, that intentionality must be in place, but at the same time, so does that mentoring. You have to find the proper family. Once you get into that family, that's why you be very careful who is going to be your teachers, the relationships that you have. First and foremost, make sure the redeemed aspect of salvation is understood, but here's a very important piece here. Make sure that whoever's teaching you is in the offensive position, not the defensive position when it comes to that restoration, because defense does not belong to Christianity. There's apologetics, but that's in an offensive position where we have the ball and we're going to carry the ball, being the truth, forward in the sense of culture and society when it comes to apologetics. But in your own personal relationship, same concept. Defense, you're not here to fight God's battles. Let Him do it.
Right.
And then we can live in the goodness. Now, you think about that, though. The offense, let's say, on a football team, fights just as hard, if not harder, than the defense. So if you don't have the ball, that means you might be preaching the word, but your tone and your nonverbals and your life you don't have the truth. You're on the defense. Get on the offensive side. And if it's an immature team, well, then together develop that and make sure, but you're developing as an offense. And then you become the offense here on earth for God, and He'll fight all your battles. It's guaranteed as a promise in the Bible.
Well, one thing about being on defense in a football game, for example, you're always moving backwards. You're giving
Yes.
up ground.
Yes, that's right.
Where if you're on offense, hopefully you're always moving forward.
Yeah.
It may just be a little bit at a time, but you're moving forward.
Yeah, one pebble at a time, Proverbs 6:6, right?
Yeah. So then we get to you started with the Great Commandment, then we get to the Great Commission.
That's right.
Which is now putting this into practice. And so from Matthew 28, do you want to read it?
Yes, sure. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's Jesus speaking, of course. Therefore, go. There's action. There's moving forward and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father. That's the Father's perspective, his philosophy, and of the Son. That's aligning yourself with his commands with that perspective, and of the Holy Spirit, which is truly that energy and that direction and truly doing something in the faith to get you to God's mission. And here it is, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the ages. Now, think about that last comment, John. I'm with you to the end of the ages. Well, this is why it's so important to get the commands of Christ, everything that he's taught us, into our working memory, to get it into our mind so that he is with us everywhere. And no matter the conflict or even the resolve, we always have those commands to truly, can I use the word fix life? Even though we have a spirit of resolve, we don't live in our problems, we live in our purpose, but at the same time, we know in a broken system there's going to be problems. But you use the commands of Christ to resolve those problems, especially your relationship problems, so that you can get back on the offense, living in your purpose as quick as you can, so that you can carry out the Great Commission.
Well, and you used, I'm going to quote you again from your manuscript. You said, generally speaking, the Christian's mission, any Christian, is to follow Christ's call. That is, to get people back into proper relationship with God and each other to live a fulfilled life now and forever. That is restoration.
That is restoration, and isn't that bringing us all the way back to the garden? Mm-hmm. Getting us back in proper relationship, just as we see Adam and Eve with God, and of course each other. That's our neighbor, with a fulfilled life now, and of course, as you implied earlier, actually you said eternity, forever.
And gets us right back to the Great Commandment then, where we're loving God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving each other in that same way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Powerful stuff.
Well, redemption and restoration, there's a lot more we could get into. There's other aspects of it, but I think we've put a lot out on the buffet table today. So
I'm going to say this, John. With these two aspects in place today, I'm going to say they're wonderfully weird.
Without a doubt. So let's leave folks with some things to think about and to chew over, as we do each week, as it relates to redemption and restoration. And number one, describe the time when you chose to redeem your life back to God, to begin restoring your life toward God's goodness. And really take some time to reflect on that. What was that moment, and what was it that made you make that decision to redeem your life back to God? And then the other side of that is, have I really began that restoration process?
That's right.
In earnest. Number two, what will you do to get the commands of Christ into your heart in order to grow into the maturity of goodness? One thing I've heard from people is, well, there's 50 commands. That's a lot. I don't know if I can remember all those. And it always brings me back to that adage of, how do you eat an elephant?
Yes.
One bite at a time.
That's right.
Or a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
The same way the same process we did with the alphabets, the English alphabet. One letter at a time.
Yep. And then number three, how will you keep the Great Commandment a priority in life? And what will you do to ensure the Great Commission is your reality? Living both sides, both the redemption and the restoration.
Yeah, and the key word there, John, is doing. You've got to do something rather than just believing. You got to put an action in place, which is part of the Holy Spirit's ministry, so that you can truly have that juxtapose or that antithesis happening, so that you can make sure that you're in good tension with God, so that you can live in your purpose.
All right. Redemption and restoration. I would challenge everyone to take more time to really do some study on those.
Yes. Thank you.
Hey, next week, we're going to go old school black and white movies at Elevating Life Church.
Yes, we are.
With the 1932, I believe it was, classic Frankenstein.
Yes.
And it's alive.
I'm so looking forward to this, because the Christian walk faith is all about being alive.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited about it.
All right. Well, we invite you, if you're in the Fort Morgan, Colorado area and you don't have a home church, come and visit us at Elevating Life Church. We would love to have you be a part of us. And leave us a comment about this podcast. You can email us at wonderfullyweirdliving@gmail.com, or you can actually send us a comment through the podcast itself, and let us know if you have any questions or comments about that. Well, Drake, always a pleasure. Always fun to pick your brain for a little while and then move on to the next topic.
Yes, I'm excited. Thank you again. I just enjoy this time so much.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for this week. For pastor, author, and speaker Drake Hunter, I'm John Waters. Have a wonderfully weird week. Thank you for joining us this week on Wonderfully Weird Living. Get your own copy of Drake's book, Wonderfully Weird, by logging on to www.wonderfullyweirdliving.com. Also, let us know if you have any questions or comments via our email address, wonderfullyweirdliving@gmail.com. For author and pastor Drake Hunter, I'm John Waters. We'll see you next time.